The first thought I had upon seeing Rachel again was that this had to be a good day. Her usual gloominess was absent. A wide smile split her face and reflected in her glossy brown eyes like a sunbeam trapped under amber. It was something that I had grown unaccustomed to over the long span of her melancholy, a look that banished the concerns that I had held within myself for weeks. As she walked over to my table, I moved my books into my bag, clearing her space across from me. "Hey," she said. Her voice rang out like a symphony. I raised an eyebrow and managed a slight smile of my own. "Hello," I said. "You look lovely today." "Thanks. I just... Damn, it's hard to explain," she said. I studied her face and added it to the manifest of present evidence. She was clearly excited by something that had happened. Perhaps she had acquired medication that worked, this time finally. "Imagine that I am a space alien," I said. She chuckled at that. "You know that company I got an internship with last year? Tri-C-Gen?" "Of course." "Well, so one of the engineers I met on campus emailed me, and he made me an offer. So I took it and she pulled back the sleeve of her hoodie, and a glint of silver was revealed. A strip of metal ran across the top of her wrists, altering the shape of them ever so slightly to thin the point at which the arm flowed into the hand. Looking at it more closely, I could see that it was not jewelry or some sort of brace. The metal had been grafted expertly into the flesh itself. My eyes widened. "What is that?" I managed to say. "Do you like it?" "I can't believe it worked, but oh my god," she said. She laughed to herself at the end of a fragmented sentence. I was in two minds, but I took the simpler option. "It's amazing," I said. "How did he do that?" I wasn't aware that things like that were even medically feasible. She corrected me automatically. "It's a project of hers. An actual cure for arthritis, and it's gorgeous too. And she's working on other projects. There's so much that's coming out on the issue and I can barely read everything on it." I nodded and placed a hand on my chin before speaking. "It works on wrists, but what about fingers? Or other parts of the body?" She said she can design things like this for basically anything. Can you imagine? If she can, oh god, think about it. She can even fix my face. And well, everything else. "Oh," I thought. This again. "I meant it when I said you look lovely," I said. "I would say divine beauty. And legitimately the most gorgeous woman I've ever met. But I think that would be gratuitous." She rolled her eyes good naturally. "Maybe," she said, drawing out the Y for a second or so. "We'll see where things go." The razor encountered a slight bump, and the smooth motion across my face was briefly arrested by the blades needing to work at a patch of nascent imperfection. A changed angle, and I was rewarded with a satisfying feeling and the sensation of skin getting just the slightest bit more glassy smooth and orderly. With the most difficult section complete, I allowed myself to fall into my thoughts again as the razor continued to work. Rachel Castro, I thought. What end are you trying to pursue? Her variety of neuroses formed a maze that was intriguing to try to make sense of, tended to make actually dealing with her on a deeper level an exceptionally grating process. It was good that she had dealt with the arthritis that had been developing in her wrists, I summarized, but I still worried about potential risks that could come to affect me. I felt something deviant along the curve of my cheekbone, grabbed it with my tweezers, and flicked my wrist outwards. A fleck of pain flowed into the pleasant sensation of skin and hair being pulled out of my skin. A long dark hair which had made a habit of emerging from the same malfunctioning part of my nose every few months. I tossed it into the bin without a single thought. At that moment there was a knock on the door. A flicker of annoyance passed through me, and I splashed lukewarm sink water in my face to remove the excess cream. It was only after several seconds had passed that I walked over, checked the peephole, and opened the door at the sight of glossy black hair. The thought that immediately passed through my mind was that my day was about to be ruined. I forced it down and adopted a practiced look of sympathy at the tableau that greeted me. Rachel stood in the door, looking profoundly miserable. "Are you okay?" I asked as I stepped by the side to let her in. "Oh, I'm fine. I just wanted to swing by," she said, in that fox cherry tone that never failed to grate on my nerves. I decided to not call out on the lie. Something felt off with the arrangement. I sensed, but I could not identify it. "Tea?" "If you want," she replied. This was my least favorite response to any possible situation. I ran through the relative optics of providing her tea versus not doing so before walking out to the kettle and pouring her a cup. She sat on the couch, not sparing it a glance. I sat on the other couch. "What do you mean to do over the summer break?" I asked. Tricygen hired me actually. I am gonna be Natalie's assistant this time. I'm actually really excited about it. "Natalie? The woman who fixed your arthritis?" "Yeah, and you?" "I've been looking for jobs," I said. "Maybe I ought to apply for a position as a pharmacist again." "Anything else?" she asked. "Not really," I lied, squashing the impulse to give her an update on all my hobbies. "I just need some money. Maybe I'll work for whatever Senate candidate pays the most for campaigning staff." "You shill," she said. "I can't deny it," I said with a shrug. She managed a ghost of a smile at that. The conversation flowed on for an hour or perhaps longer. By the third return to "What's up?" it had become clear that we had all exhausted all present topics. She stepped through the doorway and passed into the night after a smile and an embrace. As she turned to exit, and her face caught the glow of the overhead lights, I noticed just what was off. Rather than radiant brown, her eyes now shone a cool blue. Summer break came and went in a blur of pathetic paychecks, leaving me pacing across the School of Medicine's lobby as a second-year student. I held my phone in my hand, casually scrolling upwards through my text conversations. It was a convenient way of putting pieces together as I waited for the car that I had called. Rachel had not come to class. She, in fact, had missed the last 5 classes and had been absent from every spot that we had lurked in together during free hours. It was something that both concerned and intrigued me. She was still responding to text, of course, but she was physically absent. A mid-decade Toyota rolled to stop outside the building. I walked out to it, regarding the driver. The driver was a middle-aged woman, and her car smelled obsessively of lavender. "You are Mr. Clemens?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. She simply nodded and waved me in. I stepped into the car. By the second spotlight, we had established an unspoken mutual agreement not to bother one another, giving me time to think in peace. Secreto Drive, a small road full of cheap rented-out houses, was only 17 minutes away. The driver halted by the development sign and I stepped out. "Thank you," I told her, before sending her a 20% tip and walking towards the 5th house on the left. It was a familiar house, one that made me remember candlestand ravioli cooking, cat, adoption drives, and needles too close to my heart at prom photo shoots. I knocked on the door twice and tried the knob. A moment later, after formulating a sufficient justification to do so for any witness in the area. The door was unlocked to my surprise, and I gingerly turned the knob, checking through the crack of the open door. The lights were on, and everything was quiet. Rachel's cats were nowhere to be seen, and any smells of recently cooked food were absent. As I entered, my footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors of the foyer, and I winced at the sound created. They split the air still like gunshots. seeming to disrupt the uncanny equilibrium of the house. The path that I had established in my head dissolved as I looked around at the empty kitchen, the soulless living room, and the dining room. Calling for her felt as if it would end poorly. At some point, her home had acquired the same airs as an empty church, and I dared not break the suffocating silence. I began to step up the stairwell and ran my hand along the banister in order to keep myself steady. The environment grew colder gradually as I ascended. All of the doors on the upper floor were closed, and the walls were stripped bare. As I stepped onto the second floor, I noticed that the pads of my right hand's fingers were stained grey. I wiped them on the hem of my coat and proceeded. The door to her room was only 6 steps away now. It could have been 6 eternities. I forced myself upward and placed my hand on the doorknob. It was deathly cold, and as my hand instinctively recoiled, I saw that it once more was marred with dust. I raised my hand once more, forming it into a fist, and forced myself to knock once, then twice, 3 times. They sounded anemic and distant, and there was no reply. The silence fell like a shroud once more the instant I stopped. Before I could hesitate again, I gripped the doorknob once more, turned it, and thrust the door open. All of the furniture in a room had been pushed to the side in order to make space for growths of tangled machinery, which occupied the center of the room and sprawled outwards and upwards. Cables, conduits, and transparent tubes of fluid spread up the walls and ceiling. I could feel a numbing chill coming from pipes of coolant that now stood where I had recalled her nightstand once being. Among the mass of silver and black and grey, only a few scraps of tanned flesh were visible. By the time I had resisted the shape of a body amongst the garden of cables, I was already stepping back. The face that she had bemoaned in months past had been obscured, replaced with a mask of mirrored silver sculpted into the shape of an idealized female face, devoid of eye holes or a means through which to breathe. Cables and tubes obscured her chest, which I noticed seemed to be shaped differently than I remembered. All attraction that I had once derived from her form was obliterated right at that instant by the plugs and sockets which ran down what little exposed flesh remained, and through which tubes of fluid and thick wires were directly connected. In the seams between flesh and metal, I could make out lines of inflamed red and purple, where immune system was doing battle with both the foreign objects embedded in her skin and the immunosuppressant drugs that were no doubt being fed into her from the tubes. The skin of a single remaining biological arm was pallid and grayed from a lack of sunlight and sufficient oxygen. I could see additional lines of blood connected directly to its veins in order to force some semblance of life into her. Her legs, the length of which I recall she always despised, had been replaced with elongated mechanical prosthetics that would have raised her height to 6 feet tall where she is standing. And yet she was not. She was limp amongst the cables, half sitting, half lying against a frantically whirring computer tower. There was no trace of life in her form, except for the mechanically assisted rise and fall of what remained of her chest. I looked upon what I had allowed to transpire in my absence and found no words forthcoming from my mouth. For it was Rachel, or the thing that had been Rachel, that broke the silence. A mechanical arm descended from the ceiling with a whirring sound, gently taking her forearm into its grasp and folding it across her chest in a parody of modesty. A voice echoed across the room. It was distorted, mixed, and made more resonant. It still had notes of familiarity deep somewhere within. "Cassidy," she said. "Cassidy," said a distant voice. Forced through the conduits of the machine, I forced my shivering to cease for my response. "I came to ask if you were well," I said. "I think so," she said. "Rachel? What's up?" I want to know how I can help you, please." A realization was slowly flowing through me. There was no going back from this. In some sense of the word, there was no more Rachel. All of the methods I had memorized, all of the arcane surgeries that she had told me about, none of them presented the faintest path forward. I had no control here. A hiss of air echoed around the room, a reminder of the sound she would make when she heard something amusing. But it wasn't enough to make her laugh. "So you care now?" "I always cared, Rachel." I walked towards her form and sat down on the floor. The chill was reaching its tendrils into me, deadening the feeling in my ears and fingers. It all felt so distant. "No, you didn't. I always wanted to care, Rachel." She smelled like a hospital. Antiseptic, blood and plastic filled my nostrils, displacing the faint traces of perfume that seemed to linger there. I folded my hands in my lap. "Am I beautiful yet? Good enough for you?" "You always were, Rachel." "Not enough to care." "I wish that I cared more," I said. My mouth tasted like bile. The cold even numbed my tongue as it tried to move. "It scares me sometimes." "You were always my favorite sociopath," she said in her creaky robotic voice. The mechanism moved once more, lifting her biological arm. Her limp hand delicately brushed against the back of mine. The skin felt cold, forced to be alive against its will. I didn't react. "I still am," I said. "Not for long. You know what you did to yourself, don't you, Rachel?" I raised an eyebrow and looked into her masked face. It was getting difficult to breathe. Something was choking me, making me taste blood. I wanted it to be guilt, but I knew that it was cold air, a biological response to keep my lungs from being frozen. "Maybe," the machine said. "You can survive this, Rachel. You'll get an infection or some variety of malady that the machines cannot defeat. Your brain is still meat, I believe. I don't think we have the technology to change that, Rachel." Another staticky sound followed. The mechanical arm raised her hand again, manipulating it so that it clasped around mine. "I know." "Then why? I know you never wanted to die." "Do you remember when I told you I loved you?" "I do." Scenes flew through my mind. An elevated bed, her head on my shoulder, a murmured statement. "You care?" "It wasn't what we agreed to, Rachel." "You couldn't even lie to me," she said. I closed my eyes and nodded. "I couldn't," I replied. "Yes, but you cared?" "I did. But I was concerned. I'm afraid of permanence. You knew that." "You cared about how it would affect you?" Reflexivity. An argument popped into my head. The universality of action. How everything affects everyone. I forced myself to stay silent as she continued. "I want to give you something to care about." The mechanical arm suddenly whirred. Her hand squeezed mine. I felt the speed through which blood was being forced through the veins, the collapsing tissue around them. Thoughts went through my mind at the same speed. Definitions, interpretations. What do you mean?" I managed to say. "Nothing." The mechanical arm released its grip. Her hand flopped off of mine and onto my thigh. The flow of blood stopped. The whir of fans and the pulsing of coolant paused. In the depths of the computer tower that her body was still leaning against, I saw the lights turning off. "Rachel," I said, What do you mean? The only response I received was the ambience of a house within which nothing had lived for a long time. I was alone now. The last connection had been severed. A realization swam through my mind. For the first and final time, I had nobody. All I could do was lean my head against the machine that had ended both our lives and watch as my tears trickled down the casing.